Thank you very much. I was delighted that a conference on Voltaire and Newton is going to include a paper on Émilie du Châtelet, and then I saw the program and I found there's 2 papers on Émilie du Châtelet, so that's even better. I have the impression from questions earlier that not a great deal is known about her in the audience. I may be wrong there. I haven't done any new work on her for a little while, so there's going to be some sort of I haven't got anything new and groundbreaking to say, but I think perhaps there is a case for the fact that her fame as a female scientist and as one of the leading French Newtonians of the 18th century really needs to be underlined. And that's basically what I'm going to do today. I'm going to put some emphasis, obviously, on the Voltaire connection and on some of her claims to fame. And much of my paper will be contextualizing her in the French culture of the 18th century, and this will form a context for Annelise Rey's paper, which will be focused more seriously on the content. Well, she, as you know, was the is there a remote for this? Or?
You have to put it in full presentation, so you have to put it.
Oh, right, okay. Sorry. Animation slideshow. Okay, right. Here we are. Well, there she is. We've seen this picture before, and there is Voltaire's appraisal of her in a rather pedestrian English translation by John Hannah. She's most famous for her, as a Newtonian, for her Principia mathématique de la philosophie naturelle, which came out without Newton's name on the title page, and we'll see a picture of that later. My first slide of that has not come up properly, but she was hugely committed to Newton. Once she discovered Newton, she dubbed herself Emilia Newtoniana. She coined the French word to Newtonize. Je Newtonise tant bien que mal, she said. But of course, her main claim, the main attention to her has come through Voltaire. And there's no doubt that she owed a great deal to Voltaire, but it's also unquestionable that he owed a great deal to her. And that appraisal is a testimony to that. But her contribution to French science in the 18th century and to the French Newtonianism has been appallingly neglected, and it's only in relatively recent times that it's being recovered. And one still has to go over the ground, and I'm afraid I'm going to do that again a bit, because she is very much regarded as a woman who is interesting for her body and not for her mind. But there is no question that it was Voltaire's. I think it was Voltaire's interest in Newton that fired her to get to take an interest. And she was the kind of person that when she took an interest, she really wanted to know, to study deeply. And she studied. She didn't just bone up on Newton. She actually took classes in mathematics, and she and her tutors included Pierre Moreau de Maupertuis and Alexis Claude Clairaut at different times. Well, perhaps just a little bit of background. She was the daughter. She came from the noblesse d'épée, a very senior aristocracy. She married Florent Claude du Châtelet, with whom she had three children. It was an open marriage. They both had lovers. Émilie's lovers included, besides Voltaire, the Duc de Richelieu and Maupertuis himself, as well as Jean-François de Lambert, by whom she had the child after whose birth she died. And between the years 1735 to 9, she was more or less based at Cirey with Voltaire, and they devoted themselves to the study of Newton. She subsequently, when with the return of Voltaire to favour, they lived a life of celebrity in visiting Brussels, Paris, and Versailles, Fontainebleau, and attended public meetings of the Académie des Sciences. She dined with Réaumur, Clairaut, and Dortus de Marin. Just to give you a quickie on the social circle. Her name is indelibly connected with that of Voltaire, and it is. But she is interesting not just as a lover of Voltaire, but as the leading certainly one of the leading Newtonians of 18th century France. Let me just pause to say that, of course, I think it's fully endorsed what Rob was saying, that we really have to think of Newtonian science as something that is in the course of, that is fluid, that is in course of being developed and demonstrated in the 18th century, so it's not as Pope put it, God said let Newton be and all was light. It didn't all happen with a bang like that. Newton took a while for Newtonianism to be established. The text that was the most easy to read, of course, and the most widely read was the Optics. And lots of people's Newtonianism was based on the knowledge of Newton, rather, is based on the Optics. And this is as true for Voltaire as for most other people. Very few people had the mathematics to fully understand the Principia, and Madame du Châtelet was one of those. Nevertheless, it is very much Voltaire's Newton that has elements which have dominated her reputation, and where her role is acknowledged, she's been rather consigned to that of the helpmeet, or as the mere translator. In recovering her standing, we need to overlook. We tend to overlook her other work, a factor which contributes to her secondary status as a mere translator. And she contributed to this herself. She commented to one of her correspondents, "Dieu m'a refusé toute espèce de génie, et j'emploie mon temps à démêler les vérités que les autres ont découvertes," as a kind of just disseminator of other people's work. And another model for du Châtelet is she's not a lady scientist, so I'll jump over her. Is the fashionable lady scientist. It was the talk of Paris in the mid-18th century that the fashion was for the women of France to believe themselves fit for the abstract sciences. I quote from the Abbé Leblanc. "They have developed a taste for calculation," he wrote, "just as they once did for novels." And Newton has replaced Le Grand Cyrus on their dressing tables. A lady of high style cannot create a sensation unless she has a geometer in her retinue. And here we have just one such, the Duchesse du Maine, daughter of the Prince de Condé, and being tutored by Nicolas de Malezieux, who was the maths tutor to the Duc de Bourgogne. You can perhaps just make out that he seems to be dressed in slightly sort of classical garb, and this reflects the fact that he was really a classical scholar, although he did publish a handbook of geometry. But if you want, go no further than Madame de Pompadour if you want fashionable ladies interested in the sciences. She's not actually holding, there aren't any actual books of science on her desk there, but in this portrait by Quentin de la Tour, she is represented as a femme savante. She was no cotton top. She was actually quite a very intelligent woman. She owned Voltaire's Les Éléments. She also owned Algarotti's Newtonianismo per le Dame, probably in the French translation. Whether she read them, of course, is another matter. And another very slightly less grand portrait. Here's another one. She's not actually reading science. She's got the Histoire Universelle, but this makes a point about the the fashionableness of femininity of learning. But a less grand portrait is this portrait of Madame Ferrand, which was also by Quentin de la Tour, in which she is depicted as reading. Well, she's not reading, she's looking at us, but the title is she's meditating on Newton. She's actually meditating on Voltaire's Enlightenment. So, well, du Châtelet, and again, this is also Quentin de la Tour, the portrait. He had a line in obviously in painting intellectual ladies, and as you can see, she really does have the serious business of study with her. She's got the dividers there, and you can see her books are very much, the edges have very much been turned. These are not just beautiful objects on her bookshelf. These portraits testify to the acceptance of Newton in France. They're all of them, of course, post-date Voltaire's Enlightenment. They testify at least to the popularization of Newton in France. And I say that without meaning to denigrate the women involved, but they were certainly no ordinary women. And a factor we also have to take in here is the Algarotti factor. His Newtonianism, per les dames, is well known for its soft Newtonianism, and as you can see from the illustrations, they're very much this young man, or maybe he's not so young, talking to this woman who is something of a Hottentot, because she keeps asking things to be explained that seem to be quite obvious. Madame du Châtelet believed that this marquise was modelled on herself, and she was rather offended by this, as you can see from the remarks which I've reproduced on the next to it. She was actually very contemptuous of the fact that he dedicated it to Fontenelle, apart from the fact that the marquise the book was a great disappointment. She was expecting something much more profound. Madame du Châtelet did have a scientific life, and we heard about the competition in which she entered for which she wrote her dissertation sur la nature et la propagation du feu, which was published in 1744. She took an active part in the force vive controversies in the late 1630s, and she also penned this book about which we're going to hear a good deal more in the next paper, the Institution de Physique, which was also the two versions of it, or the Institution Physique, which was translated into Italian and into German. She also wrote other works. She wrote a Discours de la Bonheur, and she translated Mandeville's Fable of the Bees. That's a manuscript of the Discours de la Bonheur, which was among the collection of Voltaire's papers, which was bought by Catherine the Great. Well, to pursue her studies at Cirey, she was also greatly aided by the fact that Voltaire imported a whole laboratory of equipment. He was very much he very much tried to do a hands-on kind of science, performing experiments, and this is the man from whom he obtained his equipment, the Urbane Oye, who is here again. It's Quentin de la Tour, who is a portrait, much more simple one than less grand than the ones we've seen before. So she's somebody who was very much committed to understanding Newton's science, and it is not true that she was only converted to the idea of translating Newton at a fairly late date. It's also not true that she abandoned Newton in order to study Leibniz. and then returned to Newton, which is how Voltaire saw it. She has you can tell from her letters, she has a continuous interest in Newton, and like people of her time, she was engaged with what they saw as big problems, and one of the big problems was the whole notion of attraction, and whether this is really something that really could be accepted. She got recognition as from Voltaire, as I said, and this is just one example. Although at the time, she's obviously he here indicates that she's more superior knowledge to Algarotti, which is really not very difficult to do. But he also acknowledges in the Élément de no, I've got a better one. But in the preface to the Élément, he acknowledges her, and he said privately to people that Madame du Châtelet had helped him with this. It was a question about Voltaire's knowledge of mathematics. Voltaire's knowledge of mathematics was du Châtelet's knowledge of mathematics. She it was who explained the maths to him. It's more than likely that when she first met him, her knowledge of Newton's science was limited, but she soon outstripped him and soon became the unofficial scientific advisor to his project. She took steps to acquire the works of Newton. There's a letter to her bookseller asking him to get for her a beautiful, une belle édition, et de me les faire relier en cuir de Russie doré sur la tranche le plus tôt que vous pourrez. And it was going to be really smart volume she wanted. She also acquired the copy of the Principia that had been owned by Jean Ier Bernoulli, which was given to her by Jean de Bernoulli in 1745. She also was well read in the literature of Newtonianism. You can tell this from the discussions in the Institution, and in a letter to her bookseller, she gives a list of Newtonian literature, which includes Pemberton, Schravensand, and the Leibniz-Clark correspondence, which she wanted to obtain, and the abridged French translation by Fréré, the Abrégé de la chronologie de Monsieur le Chevalier Isaac Newton. She obviously took her interest in Newton extended to his non-scientific works. She owned his Chronology of the Ancient Kingdoms Amended and his observations on the prophecies of Daniel and St. John, which she thought was a waste of his intellectual energies. And she didn't just own these books, she read them. She told Maupertuis that she knew the optics practically by heart. This is a manuscript of copy of her notes on the optics. Well, her Principia, her Principe de here it is, the title page. As you can see, it's as if it's her book and not Newton's. And as you can tell, if you can read Roman numerals, this was a posthumous edition, published in 1659. It's a book with a complicated history, largely because of the circumstances of its completion and publication. And these have impacted on its bibliographical features, which leading Bernard Cohen to remark that the printed version is compounded of mysteries. Sorry, did I say six? Yeah. Sorry, 1759. Sorry, I'm a 17th centuryist out of my depth in the 18th century. 1759. Okay. No, we don't. Let's get the dates right. Thank you. So this is published in 1759, and I suppose the question is why she didn't publish it before she died. We know that it was finished before she went into her labour with her last child. Why didn't she publish it before that? Well, we also know that she was working She was working day and night to get it finished, and she was determined to do this before she gave birth to her child. Alexis Claude Clairaut, who helped her by checking her calculations, said that elle a travaillé comme un forçat toute l'année dernière et une partie de celle-ci à la traduction de Newton. And she also describes how she still was, I mean, we think of her as a marquise with all the time in the world on her hands. You weren't a person with all the time in the world on your hands if you were a full-time marquise. You had to look after your family, your husband's interests. You had a lot of socializing to do. She worked at night, and she worked in the wee hours. She really used her every spare minute to translate this work. It's an incredible achievement. I mean, if any woman in this room I mean, you know very well what it's like to try and think when you're pregnant. I mean, to translate Newton when you're pregnant, I think is absolutely, it's unprecedented and never been, nobody has come up to that mark, I think. But a possible explanation of her decision not to, I mean, obviously the pregnancy is a factor, but one of the things about du Châtelet's Newtonianism is that she was very up to the minute with development. She took a huge interest in the expeditions to Lapland and South America. She followed everything that had a bearing on whether verifying Newton's theories. And it's possible. One idea is that she was waiting for the return of Halley's comet, because that would be the sort of key evidence that would confirm the Newton's cosmology. Then there are others, but we don't know. The key thing is she didn't live to do anything with the manuscript. But she did make a fair copy, which she sent to the Royal Librarian. Thank goodness, because this proves her authorship of this, which has been in doubt, chiefly because people could not believe a woman could be responsible for translating. You could have had the maths, could have anything. It was attributed to Clairaut. It was said to be by other people, and so on. The problem about her death, on the many problems from the point of view of edition, is that there was nobody really to oversee it, and it wasn't published until later. But that's a page of some of the illustrations. This was something else which also held it up, according to Clairaut, that they were waiting for some engravings to be done. The book exists in two versions. There was an imprint in 1756, and then the actual edition, full edition, in 1759. And the earlier version were obviously seemed to have been either a publisher's trial copy and a couple of others. So there are actually three versions of the first one, which are very rare, and I believe there's only 12 copies available. There's a corrected 1759 one. And there's a modern reprint which is based on the early version, which is not the most accurate. So what did she have to I mean, obviously to translate Newton, she had to understand what Newton was all about. She had the maths to do that. That's the short version of that. She also had the challenge of Newton's Latin. I mean, we've been talking lumière, we've been talking light. Voltaire himself said of Newton that he talks about Newton's darknesses, his dark depths, and how difficult they are to illuminate. And this is from the 1745 version of Les Éléments, the preface, Madame du Châtelet herself, in her review of the Éléments in 1738, had commented that Newton bristles with calculations, and this puts people off. And Voltaire did a wonderful job by dealing with that. Du Châtelet herself, but in the preface of Principia, Voltaire acknowledged that she has the glory of having worked alone on translating Newton's principles, ouvrage qui aurait fait honneur à un académicien. A work which would have been an honor for an academician, which of course she wasn't. Although she herself called translators négociants de la République de lettres, mere merchants or tradesmen, she insisted that it was actually a very serious work, and that it particularly work of œuvre de raisonnement were particularly valuable for translating. In translating Newton, she had communicability in mind. That meant both clarity in both style and in maths. So her book is more than, her Principia is more than just Newton's text. It has an exposition of the system of the world, exposition du système du monde. It has a set of explanations of the principal astronomical phenomena, and it has a section called the solution analytique, which deals with some of the main problems that were of the day, and offers mathematical algebraic solutions.
Could you just tell us which edition she has?
Sorry, I think she used the Coates edition. The second edition, yes. She certainly reproduces the Coates preface in her edition. She translates the Coates preface. She confronted the difficulties of Newton's style by rendering Newton's abrupt Latin in fluent humanistic prose, and that's the Système du Monde, manuscripts of that. This, just very, very quickly, just some examples of her translating. That's perhaps less interesting, but a couple of things. It wasn't just a matter of making Newton more fluent, it was also more appropriate to the great genius he was. The little touches, like when he talks, uses a comparison of talking about that phenomena in different parts of the world should obey the same laws. He uses the lucis igne culinari, so the cooking fire. She irons that out in her translation. It's just the lumière du feu highlighted there, and she also modernizes his expressions in ways that again are more comprehensible. So these terms that people still have trouble with, intendi et remiti, she renders as augmentation et diminution. Anyway, reasons of time, I won't dwell on this. Just underline that she was. So she presented a whole package which enabled people, gave people the wherewithal to really tackle the main text if they wanted to, but could get the gist rather than they could from the élément, from just the système du monde at the end. Now the big puzzle is, it's a good question whether Voltaire was more influential or Madame du Châtelet. There's no question, but Madame du Châtelet commanded the respect of Diderot, who took her, lists her as one of France's great Newtonians in the Encyclopédie, and he published took her sections from the Institution on space and time and on hypotheses for the Encyclopédie. Whether he read the Principe is an open question. In fact, who read the Principe is a big question. I haven't done a systematic examination of copies, but the copies I've looked at are all very, very clean. They don't look as though they've been read very much. So there is possibly an irony that actually Voltaire's less specialist work was far more widely known than du Châtelet's expert work. But of course, you only need a prodigy or two to pass the message on. But again, everybody, I think another catch here is people who were mathematically literate enough to read Newton probably also read Latin, so they didn't need the French translation. So there is this big question as to whether she did read, she was read, or her translation was read, although it is rightly described as the only French translation. But I wonder, I mean, I still wait to be for the evidence for the fact that that it was the principal means of access to the Principia for the whole generation of French physicians and géomètres. But if people if anyone here has evidence on that, I would be very interested to hear it. I will end with just one little story about my own disappointment when I came across this picture. There is a literature on this picture, as I subsequently discovered, but I didn't. I was at the Münster Pinakothek, Alte Pinakothek, and stumbled across it, not knowing that it was there, and I got very excited because at first I thought, judging by the size of the book that it was behind her, that it was Châtelet, but it isn't, of course, because if you look closely at the text, it is de Newton, that doesn't figure as a running head on du Châtelet's edition. So this is evidence of Voltaire's Newton being read by a woman, another woman whose intellectual credentials have been misrepresented. She has been talked about as somebody of no significance. In fact, she was connected with Condillac and Diderot, and she was not an insignificant bourgeois. She was a member of the aristocracy, and she was very much a part of a constellation of intellectuals in Paris in the middle of the 18th century. So she is evidence of Newtonian science, Newtonian theories being read by the intellectual elite, but we still wait evidence for the readership of du Châtelet's Newton and I. My guess is the tragic circumstances why she died of what is now believed to be a pulmonary embolism shortly after the birth of her child, successful birth of her child, is probably the brain. The book went into the world with nobody to promote it. Thank you very much.
Well, maybe a little bit late. The book has now gone on. Thank you very much. That's wonderful, and for keeping the time so well. Just make one comment about your saying how she was making Newton more easy to be read. I have a great friend, a Czech friend, who says one of the great things about doing Shakespeare not in English is that the modern translations could make him comprehensible to the audience, whereas so much of Shakespeare is lost to us now, unless you really find out how words have changed their meaning. I won't make any more comments. Can we have first questions or comments from the audience then? Yes.
In her final
Now can we start so that people
in her
can
final pregnancy, did she have a strong intimation that she wouldn't survive, and was probably working to get stuff out?
I think any woman in those days had to face that fact. That was a fact of giving birth, yes. And there is epistolary evidence that that was on her mind. It was not a foregone conclusion that the outcome would be difficult, but a difficult one. And but though she was much older, of course, there was that factor as well. But I think she was. I think that was really a major consideration in deciding she really had to get this work finished.
Yes, there.
I wondered if there were any mileage in slightly widening one's geographical perspective for looking at du Châtelet, and looking particularly to Italy. I'm thinking of mathematicians, female mathematicians like Betsey, perhaps preeminently of Lara Bassi, the ornament and icon of the Bologna Academy, a professor at the university and a Newtonian, and working comparatively in that sense. Otherwise, Châtelet can seem quite unique and extraordinary. She was relatively unique and extraordinary, but not absolutely so.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, in some ways, the problem is the nationalist take on history, science, philosophy, whatever. There is a German du Châtelet, because she's the promoter of Leibniz's philosophy, as we'll be hearing. There is also an Italian dimension, and the Italian and both are particularly important. And in both cases, and of course the Swiss, because the Bernoulli, but in both cases, Germany and Italy, there is contact, because of course Voltaire went to Frederick's court. She angled to try and go with him, but it didn't work out. And so there is a personal link there. And in Italy, Algarotti, she never said anything publicly about her disappointment about Algarotti, but the quotation that I showed you there was from a letter. But Algarotti was I think, was instrumental in making her possibly instrumental in getting her institution translated in Italy, and it is, I think, very significant, of course, that it was Bologna, and that's where Laura Bassi is based, and that has a university out of papal control, a university with a very different tradition from a lot of universities in Italy, but where the very few, but there were some women who did actually. Even as in her case, get to teach. So yes, I think it's enormously important to realise that there is to try and to map this across European culture.
Thank you. Yes,
I think, sorry. And the way you've given this talk and the way we usually think of her is in the context of Newton and in such, but to broaden the context, as John just suggested, I think there were a huge number of women who were translating. She herself translated other books, I can't remember what they are. But so there is this whole phenomenon of women as translators. So for example, Elizabeth Carter, the Bluestocking, translated Algarotti from Italian into English, or later in that century, there was a woman who translated Humboldt's voyages from French into English. And then there's also an Émilie du Châtelet equivalent in Victorian England, because she translated Newton's Principia into French, and then Laplace was known as the French Newton and wrote La Mécanique Céleste, and that was translated into English by Mary Somerville. So I think a completely different way of thinking about her would be to see her in a global community of female translators, and it's just that she happens to do a scientific text.
Yes, thank you very much for that. I completely agree with you. I was just trying to pull her out. The trouble with the translator label is that it tends to be used in a derogatory way. That somehow translators are lower order of being. They're just trading off other people's work. But there is a level of translation, of course, which she's fully aware, and Mary Somerville was fully aware, that you cannot undertake that task without actually having a knowledge that's close to what you're knowing what you're translating. So yes, I think, but I think the status of translating needs to be actually raised, and in order to really give them the recognition that they deserve, because of course there were restrictions for many women on how they could exercise their minds in print, and translating was an acceptable way to do that.
Stand up.
Can I contest your evaluation of Châtelet, compare with another mistress? I don't think Châtelet had any Newtonian scientific achievement at all. You may correct me. But the person who did was Clara's mistress, who it seems was actually responsible for doing the calculations, the return of Alice Comet, which is to my mind the greatest Newtonian achievement of them all. And I'm just wondering, since she publishes 1759, 2 years after the return, if she gives credit to Clara's mistress. I've forgotten Clara's mistress's name. Does anybody know it? No?
Well, she couldn't, you mean she, du Châtelet?
No, she wasn't Clara's mistress. Clara was her mistress.
So, when you said whether she gives credit?
Yeah, does Châtelet give credit?
Well, she couldn't because she was dead.
In 1759?
Yes.
Sorry, I missed that. When did she die?
1756.
Oh, sorry. I missed that.
Well, I think actually this, I mean, I don't see why we should have to pull one lady out and it should be one and not another. I mean, I think there are more women, there are more women that are known about who were actually deeply and actively involved in mathematics and science. And there's a, you know, they're being recovered even as we speak. I mean, I don't think this is perhaps a forum for us to debate whether about Châtelet's, whether Châtelet was a Newtonian or not, because it would probably take too long.
No,
But
scientific achievement was issue I was raising. I don't think it was, or if it was, in the case of Clara's mistress.
well, it wasn't my bid that she was a that she actually was had scientific achievement in the sense that she had new theories or broke ground in that sort of way, but she had the understanding and the knowledge that was possible, that made it possible for her to translate Newton, and she had enough scientific know-how to engage in scientific enterprises as she did in writing her dissertation on fire. So I'm not saying she's a great scientist in a modern sense. I'm saying she's a great, but she is a scientist in the sense that she is fully and a great one at the level of her understanding and her practice. And I think we should acknowledge people for that.
Well, the only point is, well, she still says, people regard me as a mere translator. Well, wasn't she? I mean, was she more than a translator? That's the point I'm getting at. Or did she just translate?
Yes, she was more than a mere translator, and we'll hear more about that in the next paper.
Okay, yeah.
She wrote. She wrote much. The Newton translation is just her final work. The final work. She wrote a lot of other things as well, some of which were still in manuscript when she died.
There is a huge difference, of course, between translators who actually understand what they're translating and those who don't. Yeah, there's a lot of very poor translations around in the world.
Yes.
One other thing, how does her translation of French compare with the Coates into English? I've never sort of thought about that.
Well, according to Voltaire, it was infinitely better, and it made Newton much easier to read. And of course, the Frenchman would say that, wouldn't he? But that it was much clearer.
Yeah, no, I've heard that too, that it was a very good job in that, which must speak from a true understanding of the science.
I think I might say it remains the only French translation to this day.
Yes. Yes.
It remains the
Yes.
translation.
I mean, it may very well be that as Latin falls away, you know, this is going to become the standard French version. People will be reading it in the 21st century. I don't know.
Well, it is in print.
I cannot resist here an anecdote. I was at the 300-year anniversary of the Principia at Cambridge. I spoke on the first day of that about Descartes and all the stuff with absolute or relative motion, and showed a picture of Descartes. And the next day, Thibaut d'Amour, the great French relativist, spoke, and he said he didn't like what I'd said about Descartes, and in particular I'd chosen that awful portrait of him which makes him look miserable. There was a much better one. And now I shall take my revenge. I shall read you Newton in French. This was Madame de Châtelet, of course. Right, I think it was perhaps here, and we've still got a good bit, we've still got 6 or 7 minutes. Yeah.
I was just interested in the
Could you stand up?
I was just interested in the circulation of her text. Do you have any sense at all of how many copies were printed and also what it cost? I mean,
Well, it must have cost an awful lot of money, and and Voltaire does seem to have been part of it. I don't know the full story there. I mean, I would be very interested to know more about that. But so he may have had something to do with the financing of it. I don't actually know. The copies that, again, I haven't done a systematic search and study of them, search for and study of them, but the copies that I have found are in the copies I have looked at are in university collections. There's a copy I think the copy in the Clark Library. There's copies in Berlin. I'm not sure, but what their provenance is, I don't know. I couldn't tell you. But that is obviously something to investigate. There are a lot more Du Châtelet manuscripts have come onto the market. In fact, some of these slides are precisely. I mean, that's taken from a Christie's sale in 2012. And hopefully these will become available. It's not at all clear whether they will. Well, they come from the Du Châtelet family, actually. So there may be more material that there is more material here to be studied, and there is now at last interest in Du Châtelet has developed in France. So hopefully, particularly coming out of that there will be further investigation of these things.
Yes, Catherine. And then
Yes, I was mentioning this morning that Newton was seen as dispelling the black clouds of superstition even more than Descartes. Is there any evidence that Madame du Châtelet was also interested in theological superstition or socio-political issues generally, or was she just really interested in math and science?
Oh, she had quite wide interests. She translated Mandeville. She wrote this treatise sur la bonheur, on happiness, and she wrote the Institution de Physique. She took her correspondence shows a lively interest in the world going on around her, and a good understanding of how the politics of absolutist France works and so on. Now, one of the interesting things, or one thing that struck me when I was trying to puzzle out why there were these two versions, the difference between the two versions of the Institution de Physique, and looking at why she was eventually won round on the issue of gravitational attraction, and one of her big concerns was actually theological. And there is quite a lot about God in the Institution, and she, but not in she's not writing it's much more kind of Voltairean. I mean, it's a general idea of God, not a specific either Catholic or Protestant or particular theology. But she certainly has a sense of that the religious dimension has some importance. It's not, I wouldn't say primary, but it is definitely something to consider. And when you see her translation, she in the General Scholium, you can see a translation of her General Scholium, incidentally, on the Newton Project's Canadian branch, which has got a whole lot of different versions of the General Scholium, when she calls God as le Seigneur, which is much more like the God that one might address, pray to. It seems to me, but maybe I'm being a bit subjective there.
I think this will be the last one.
As a mere chemist, I'm interested. The dissertation on fire, were she and Voltaire both working with the phlogiston theory?
I'm not equipped to answer on that. I think that doesn't come into her version of it. So a short answer is I don't know. But in the Institution de Physique, you do find her. The group of Newtonians that she seems to be most critical of are actually the chemists. And what they're trying to do with gravitation in
how life is a chemistry.
They were alchemists. He was an alchemist.
Sorry?
He was an alchemist. He was still.
Alchemy is old chemistry, isn't it?
I think we'll have the last last one now.
This is an answer to the question about what unique contributions a translator can make. I was just looking in her 1737 paper on fire that she wrote that summer when she and Voltaire were working on it. The first thing I found was in a private letter, a constraint she had, which many female scientists today do not have. She wrote to a friend, "I couldn't perform any experiments this summer because I wouldn't have been able to hide them from Mr. Voltaire." But she didn't want to offend his ego. But in her paper, she made a very perspicacious comment from 1737, well before this translation. She suggested fruitful experiments could be conducted concerning the distinctive heating power of different colored light. And this was about more than 60 years before Herschel helped develop concepts of infrared radiation. So I thought it was quite nice without being able to do experiments.
If I could just add a quick gloss on that. She didn't want Voltaire to know she was going in for the same thing for whatever reason. I mean, perhaps he wanted to do this independently. And her letters show she was doing her work late at night and up in her own room. So it's not in different circumstances. Presumably, she could have actually used some of the equipment.
Well, with that splendid image of those two, I think we'll stop. Thank you very much.